Excellency President Thabo Mbeki, distinguished fellow panelists, organizers of the event, the CEO of the HSRC. I'm a Nigerian. She said a Nigerian flavor. So we are very good in protocol. And if we haven't done the protocol, we don't get into our act. So do excuse me for all of these protocols, but in order not to eat more into my time, I will say all protocols observed. The theme of African solutions to African problems is a very large one, and it is one which strikes at the very heart of the entire Pan-Africanist project. It goes back at least 500 years, when the African continent began gradually to lose control of its destiny and had to find a way to organize itself in order to begin to regain control of that destiny. It's a theme, I was saying, that goes back 500 years, if we were to trace it, as historians have done. And as a subject, it's one which strikes at the very heart of the entire Pan-Africanist project. A project committed to seeing how, having lost control of the continent, Africans could begin to organize themselves to regain control of the continent. And it is a struggle which is not over yet. If it were over, we would not be discussing this theme today. And I would suggest that the first lesson which history teaches us is that if we were to fully regain control of the destiny of this continent, we would have to do so by being the drivers of the destiny of the continent. There's no amount of goodwill, there's no amount of external love, there's no amount of international solidarity that will make a difference if we do not have control of the driver's seat in terms of the affairs of our continent. And the big fight, which has always been the historical fight, at least of the last 500 years, has been who exactly is going to control Africa. Is Africa perhaps not too important to be left to the Africans themselves? And we only need to look into the narratives that have informed much of the politics of domination of the last 500 years to begin to see that the answer, emphatically, of much of the world, especially of our interface with Europe, which played an important and central role in the onset of the subordination of the continent, is essentially that Africa is too important to be left to Africans alone. It may play itself out in more subtle forms today. Certainly the language of the civilizing mission of colonialism is not deployed as blatantly as it was some 500, 300, 400 years ago. But nevertheless, we continue to hear language, some of it couched in the discourse of humanitarianism, which essentially says Africans are not mature enough or capable enough to manage their own affairs, and somehow the international community, that nebulous concept, international community, even if it is a handful of countries, international community must do something in order to rescue Africa, if not from Africans themselves, at least from their own leaders. And I would like to suggest, therefore, that in order for us to answer the question of how we can effectively drive African solutions to African problems, we would need to learn important lessons from our history of the last 500 years. We would not be the first to attempt to find answers to this question. If you go back to the discourses of Henry Sylvester Williams and the efforts of people like Marcus Garvey and the pioneers of the entire Pan-Africanist project, theirs was in fact one of the most courageous attempts to begin to redefine the narrative around Africa in order to set the stage for a repoliticized engagement with the continent that will help to regain control over the destiny of the continent by Africans. And no effort was spared to punish them for their effort, in the same way as some of the most patriotic African leaders post-colonial have been punished for their efforts. Remember what happened to Marcus Garvey. ended up in prison. Just as some of those who led the most courageous wars of resistance against the colonial imposition were either deported to islands in the Caribbean or off the African coast, or in some cases simply imprisoned, humiliated. I would suggest in parallels that are not too completely dissimilar to some of the things which we witness today in terms of the way in which a one-sided international criminal justice system is deployed, particularly targeting the weakest links in the international system. And I do not mean that in pointing to some of the contemporary parallels that we should ignore problems of misgovernance on the continent. That is not the point at all. I think we Africans are probably amongst the most critical when it comes to our governments. Actually, Pat, having lived in Sweden, and we interacted from that period, I would argue that Africans are generally more rebellious towards government than people in other parts of the world. I have never seen a more conformist people than when I lived in Sweden. They obey everything, so long as it comes from government. We challenge by cartoons, by songs, if not by direct political action. We take to the streets to challenge. And that spirit of resistance and of contestation has always been part of the political culture of our continent, in contrast to the conformism that has been beaten into other people in other regions of the world in order to ensure that a certain governability of political communities is achieved. And so I would say that in the context of the contemporary challenges we are confronted with on the continent, the question is not whether we condone malgovernance or bad governance, as it is popularly called, but that rather we insist that in correcting problems on our continent, we reserve the right to lead that struggle and not for others to help, quote unquote, in leading the struggle and in the process hijacking the struggle as part of a broader hegemonic agenda that effectively produces some of the disjunctures in the international system that we see today. So deportation as a weapon of colonial domination and external imposition as a weapon of post-colonial domination are two sides of the same coin in terms of the struggle for retrieving the identity of the continent and ensuring that Africans can take control over their own destiny. And I'm very concerned that in a lot of cases, those of us who are in the front line of struggle on our continent, sometimes in civil society and sometimes also within government, actually, there are those who challenge bad administration, who challenge undemocratic governance, who contest corruption, and who fight for citizen rights and the enjoyment of full citizen benefits on the continent. That sometimes we get carried away by the language of domination, which is actually employed to try to control the destiny of this continent. So that when we hear, for example, about impunity, concepts like impunity, there's nobody who would be against impunity. If we took a straw vote here now and asked, would you punish any office holder, public office bearer, who misbehaved in public office? All of us will agree. But I want to suggest that behind the language of contemporary impunity is actually a very loaded set of ideological and power relationships, which we need to unpack, and which leads me to suggest that our challenge today is not simply to revitalize civil society activism, but to do so on the basis of a politicized civil society that is able to read between agendas, that is able to go beyond agendas that are proposed as neutral discourses in the international system, and to challenge those agendas on the basis of a proper immersion in the African world, which recognizes that this is a wounded continent and a continent that is in need of restoration and that the project of restoration is not one which is necessarily shared universally across the board in the same way. So when we hear again about notions of structural adjustment, which is really where I did most of my own research, I was quite amazed the speed with which African governments signed on to World Bank and IMF structural adjustment. And I remember discussing in Nigeria with the person who was the dominant figure in the Nigerian structural adjustment program. And he said to me, are you against structural adjustment? Everybody in life has to undergo some structural adjustment. Even in your personal life, you do structural adjustment from time to time. When you don't have money as a student, when you were an undergraduate, you did structural adjustment. You had a formula for eating, 001, no breakfast, no lunch, dinner, because you didn't have money. When you got your scholarship money paid, then you went 111. That's structural adjustment. So what's your problem? But in fact, again, we miss the point that the hegemonic powers and forces in the international system, having learned lessons themselves in refining the art and the science of domination, have also invented language to match the refinement. So that nobody is going to come to say to you in very crude terms, we are taking over the levers of your economy. They come with graphics. And that was in the 1980s, right? Most of us were new to computers. And worse still, our military leaders who were in power in most of Africa did not have any clue about computers. So Chicago boys working in the IMF and the World Bank, coming into a ministerial conference room, doing graphics that were jumping left and right, and saying to them, this is structural adjustment. This is what will happen to your economy. They say, it looks good. We will go for this one. And our task is then to impose structural adjustment. And those who oppose us will be structurally adjusted politically at home. And so this is the kind of experience which we go through. And it took 25 years of this for us to wake up to the fact that if there was any lost decades in the history of Africa post-independence, it was the structural adjustment years. Did the IMF and the World Bank apologize for it? They didn't. It took Joseph Stiglitz. And I want to underscore this point. I listened to Joseph Stiglitz 3 times when he began his post-Washington consensus speeches as senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank, to begin to say that first and foremost, as economics as a discipline goes, structural adjustment is bad economics. And that was first speech in Washington. Second speech in Geneva was to say, beyond the Washington consensus, we need to begin to look at how you resolve problems in an alien economy without necessarily killing the economy.